Good morning, everyone. I want to actually read another text for our meditation this morning. It's from the book of Exodus, chapter 2, um, starting verse 11. And I am at one point going to refer to the text we just read in Matthew also. But I'll focus on this text in Exodus chapter 2, starting on verse 11, referring to the time when Moses was in Midian. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew on one of his kinsfolks. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well until verse 15, and then I'm skipping over to chapter 3. Verse 1. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I'll send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Until verse 10. As already observed, we are in the first Sunday in Lent. This is a period of time in our liturgical calendar, or Christian calendar. It goes from Ash Wednesday, which was last Wednesday, right after Carnival, to the Passion of Christ, the Thursday before the Easter Sunday, or maybe, the Sunday before Easter Sunday. Anyway, there are some differences there. It basically corresponds to these 40 days, between Ash Wednesday and the Passover or Easter Sunday. We call it in Portuguese Quaresma, referring to the 40 days. 40, and also it's a symbolism of the 40 days and nights that Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. It also reminds us of another 40 years of Moses in the desert, or the people, the Israelites in the desert, during 40 years before they entered the promised land. But this time of the year before Easter Sunday, before we celebrate Christ's resurrection, it's taken in our Christian experience as a time of preparation. Different traditions have different practices for this period. Some involve fasting, abstaining from certain food or luxuries, a time of prayer, or simply as a time of reflection, pondering on Christ's sacrifice and simple living. And we decided, or I suggested, that we could celebrate this time this year through a series of messages reflecting on the desert wilderness experiences in the Bible and in our lives. The 40 years of Moses, as I said, the wilderness, the temptation of Christ, and so on. So the next few Sundays, I and Nathan will be bringing messages here related to the desert or the wilderness and what this means in our Christian experience and our Christian faith. And our first text is the one that I just read in Exodus. And I want to take a look at it. And before we go into more detail, just a quick recap of what's going on here. The Israelites are in Egypt. They are being slaved by the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Moses is that little boy that was born after Pharaoh had decreed that all Hebrew boys should be killed. But his mother saved him, putting him in a basket and put him in the river. And then the daughter of Pharaoh, found the little boy, the baby, and she took the little baby and she raised the child, and Moses becomes a grown man. Now, he grew up in a Pharaoh's household, and he becomes a grown man, and he is sensitive to the issues involving his people. He was a Hebrew born, and he sees that the Egyptians were oppressing the Hebrews. And as we read, chapter 3, he wants to do something about it. So he goes out. He sees an Egyptian fighting with an Hebrew, and he said, well, I need to stop that. So anyway, we just read, he tries to do something about that, and but that didn't go too well. Next day, when he's trying to stop a fight between two Hebrews, or he killed that Egyptian, and when he tries to stop a fight between two Hebrews, they said, you're the one that killed that Egyptian yesterday. Moses says, they're already put in the social media. It's all spread out, people, everybody's knowing. Whole Egypt is knowing that I'm the one. So now Moses is I guess, in the most wanted list for killing an Egyptian. And he runs for his life. We read in chapter 3 that he chapter 2. We've read in chapter 2 that Pharaoh wanted to kill Moses. So Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he settled in the land of Midian. I would say this is the first experience of, wilderness experience. Although we have more details about this, when Moses is with the Israelites later on. But it's normally accepted that Moses was around 40 years of age at this point, or actually, 40 years of age when this happened. And he spends another 40 years in Midian, taking care of the flock of his father-in-law. So he runs from Pharaoh. Soon he finds a wife and a job, and he stays there for a while. And so he's about 80 years old, probably close to his retirement, at least for our standards. But he will live another 40 years, according to what we have in Scripture. But God has other plans for Moses at this point. So Moses is tending to the flock, and we're told that he was keeping the flock. He went beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Roughly, the wilderness here is referring to geographically the Sinai Peninsula, somewhere between Egypt and Palestine. There's that, peninsula, we call it peninsula, that actually, a huge piece of land there. And what do we call this today? The Persian, it's above the Persian Gulf, or the canal, the Suez Canal, anyway, it's wilderness. In Portuguese, we have just one word basically to describe desert. Deserto. As in English, we have desert or wilderness. Wilderness, usually it's known, physically, a desolate place. It's not your typical Sahara desert, just sand. It's a deserted place, has some vegetation. Maybe it doesn't have much water, springs or rivers anyway. But it's a place where shepherds would take their cattle for the pasture. So there's some sort of vegetation, but it's a very desolate place. It's a place of emptiness. It's described physically as a place of emptiness, of isolation, desolate, and so on. But we see the several stories in the Bible of this place as a place also of some sort of experience of the people of God or individuals, where they have some sort of encounter with God. So there's a paradox. Actually, in our call to worship, we started reading that we have entered into the season of Lent. Sundays, however, are not a part of Lent. We have entered the wilderness time, yet this day of worship is an oasis in the desert. So there's actually a paradox of these wilderness experiences. It's a time of and a place of isolation, emptiness, but normally it's a place of encounter with God, of new experience, of directions. Although here in this case of Moses, we have it as somewhat different from what we see later in the wilderness with the people that left Egypt. Moses' experiences here helps us understand also the significance of this desert experience. What are some marks of it? It's a voluntary or involuntary escape from a troubled situation, which is what's happening with Moses. He was threatened, his life was a risk, and he goes away, he flees, he runs for his life. So he's running, escaping from a troubled situation. We can say, sort of involuntarily, he had to, or else he'd be killed. It's a time, as I said already, in a place of emptiness. It's like being void of everything that defines us as person. Involves losses. As we read in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus' temptation. If you notice, Jesus is tempted in three major areas. His subsistence, food. He was hungry at the end of 40 days. How is he gonna sustain himself if he doesn't have something to eat? So it's a time where our basic needs are challenged. Second thing, he was questioned about God's providence. Look, throw yourself from here. Don't you believe in God? God's going to send his angels. So our faith in God, our trust in God is put to question. Do you believe? Is your God really what you say he is? Well then, put him to test. Throw yourself from here. And the third thing is power. Jesus is tested in his power. Aren't you the Son of God? Oh, you can do all things. Well, actually, I'm going to give you all this. Jesus was sort of powerless. He was at the hand of Satan. Satan led him to the desert. So the desert, we have these accounts in our Bible, but this has become also some sort of, in the Christian tradition, some sort of spiritual practice or existential experiences in our lives. Normally, it's also a very defining moment in the lives of those involved, like Moses, Jesus in the New Testament, the Israelites, and others. It's a transforming, a life-changing experience. Now, in the third century AD, in Egypt, actually, some Christian men fleeing from persecution of the cities or just escaping from the pagan cities, they went to live out in the desert as hermits. And they went to actually, probably the Sahara Desert. This is probably the beginning of what became later known as the monasteries in the Christian tradition. Christians who wanted to escape from either persecution or from the pagan life in the cities, they went to live isolated in the desert. Again, this became a spiritual practice in the Christian tradition. Later on, in the 4th century, when Christianity became the religion of the state, of the empire, many Christians didn't like that and said, well, no, we don't follow Jesus to become associated with the power, with empire. So there again, many, in this case, it wasn't because of persecution. On the contrary, the persecution ceased, and Christianity became the official religion. And they left, many left the cities and also started some of these monasteries. Well, these Christian men, and there were women also. They're less known in our history and so on. They became known as desert fathers, desert mothers, perhaps, or amas, I think were the names that were used for the women. People who decided voluntarily to live in isolation. Some spent the rest of their lives this way. But as I said, this became a spiritual practice. And maybe even today, there are some who do that temporarily. They retreat themselves to some isolated place where they can dedicate time for prayer, for reading, for meditation, and so on. And during Lent, we try to celebrate and remember some of these experiences. And these experiences is firstly a time or a place of isolation and emptiness. But sometimes we are involuntarily put in situations in our lives. So even if you don't physically go to a deserted area or retreat yourself to a spiritual renewal or something, I'll say that we can also learn from these passages when we experience in our day-to-day life some desert experiences, losses we have, times in our life when everything we know about Jesus, about God, doesn't seem to sustain us. Everything that defines ourselves seems to be out of order. We're sort of lost. We may be in the middle of a crowd, but we feel isolated. We feel empty. So I'm thinking of the desert experience also as an existential experience that we have of emptiness. Well, we call this depression, or we can have other names for that. And we have other solutions for that today, in modern life. But it's typical that we as modern men and women, we may be living in a city, and we may be living in a, having a very busy schedule. There's a sense of emptiness and isolation. And maybe even questions about God's providence and care for our lives. So the second thing that I want to notice here in Moses' experience, okay, he found a job, he found a wife, he had a son, and so on. Actually, he gives the name of his son as a Gerson, because I'm a foreigner. Yeah, I'm a pilgrim in a foreign land. So that's how he describes it. I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. So let's say Moses is now he was able to organize his life again. Now he's taking care of the sheep and so on. Well, God is going to take him away from that comfort zone, let's say. So Moses comes to the mountain of God, which Sinai or Horeb is called here. And he meets God. So there's a paradox in the desert experience. At the same time, it's a time of emptiness, but it's a time of encountering God and what God has for us. In a sense, and some say that it's only when we empty ourselves from all that we are able to come to terms with what God wants for us, for our lives. He comes to the holy presence of God, such a sacred place that he had to remove his sandals. And he hears from God himself, something so extraordinary about God's own character. It's very interesting, chapter 3, verse 7 and 9. God says, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land. Actually, at the end of chapter 2, there's a similar saying, verse 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, they cried for help, up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Of course, we don't have time to go deeper on this, but just to point out that the desert experience is a time of questioning. Satan questioned Jesus. Well, don't you believe in God? He's going to take care of you. It may be a time of questioning. Okay, we might not, you might not be there physically, but our existential experiences sometimes makes us question. And what we see here reaffirmed is God sees. God hears. God knows our situation. Even though sometimes we can't materialize it. We can't put it in a clear way before our eyes. But actually, it's the basic message we see through the whole Bible. God is here. God is there when you need it. You may not notice. You may not be aware. Sometimes we need to empty ourselves from our securities, from the things that make us confident of ourselves and make confidence of who we are. We need to be emptied from this, or like we say it today, we need to detox from all that we trust. to be able to hear and to be aware that God is here. So this time of emptiness, of isolation, is also a time of closeness to God. And finally, is a transforming moment in our lives. It was transforming for Moses. Moses' life was completely redirected from this point on. He meets God in the mountain, and God shows his plan for Moses. Moses, I have a plan for you. You have to go out there and call your people and lead them out of Egypt, out of that slavery. And we can, go back and say, well, Moses had that sensibility and he had a heart for his people in Egypt. He tried to do something about it, and that didn't go well. And he thought, well, this is gone. I'm not going to go into that anymore. But in order for him to be able to be so effective in what he wanted to do, he had to empty himself and he had to be shaped by God. This is what this 40 years experience in Midian meant for Moses. In a positive sense, this desert experience is also a symbolism, or a way for us to voluntarily take this spiritual practice when we need direction from the Lord to our lives. It can be a time of redirecting our lives. It's interesting how this is used even in the secular world. I don't know if you've heard, but you can actually go to a monastery and spend a week or two in a monastery, and even if you're not a religious person. And non-religious people do that. They go to have this spiritual experience, and so they can sort of reshape their lives. These desert experiences that we have it registered in the Bible can teach us also not only where we can voluntarily go to a wilderness or desert, but how we handle involuntarily situations where we are going through a desert, going through the valleys of our lives, the deserts of lives, and be transformed in encountering with God. But you may say, well, I've gone through hard times in my life, but it doesn't seem like I had that encounter with God or a complete reshaping of my life and so on. True, sometimes we go through some experiences that it's not, I mean, we didn't, it's nothing like what Moses experienced, of us being able to, be in a holy place or have a holy experiences. True, sometimes we're not completely clear of how these experiences shapes us, but in a sense, they can also be opportunities for us to understand what God is doing in our lives. So I hope that the next few Sundays we will learn a little bit more about these experiences and how to deal with our desert experiences in our lives. May God bless us. Amen.